First, I just want to quickly talk about the setup. I think the setup of your environment, your camera, your microphone is really important as an instructor, because when you're in the classroom and you're in front of the class, you have their attention, you have the presence. It's the same with teaching online. You have to build that presence. So let's just quickly cover that. One, your camera. Your camera should be eye level. Imagine if you're sitting across from someone, mentoring them or teaching them, you're looking them in the eyes. You don't want your camera low. When your camera is low, you're always looking down into your camera, and that's as if the instructor's looking down on the students. So if you can, prop up whatever camera you're doing. If it's on your laptop, keep it eye level. Number two, you should be in the frame. You should fill the frame of your camera, because it makes the students feel closer to the instructor. If you have too much space around you, then the student feels that they're distant from the instructor. It's hard to build a connection. We want to use all these tips so we build that connection. So you just should have about a hand width above your head to the top of the frame. You should fill most of the frame, because remember, as the instructor, you're the presence. Number two, your lighting. If you don't have good lighting, there's very inexpensive lighting, a ring light or whatever you want to do. Whatever you want to use just to light up your face. Number three, your audio. What I have found is most computer audio will work. Remember, there is a difference. There is a difference between using online for a company or organizational meeting and using technology to be an instructor and train. When you are using a technology in a meeting, it really doesn't matter what your audio, your video, the camera height looks like, right? You're there to give input with a bunch of other people into a meeting. But when you're the instructor, you have to set the stage. What I have found is the better your audio, it stresses the ears less for your students, especially in a long course. If you don't have a good microphone, by the end, your students may be starting to check out. And once again, you can Google inexpensive, just microphones, USB that you can plug into, just to give you that advantage. There's an argument that said that in today's generation, or whether it's online learning, that people have a short attention span. And I disagree with that. And the reason I disagree with that is because I know people that have spent days binge watching Tiger King. I've never watched it, but I know they have been binge watching it, or their favorite Netflix show. So how do people have short attention spans, but they'll give all their attention span to the TV? And we have to capture their attention the same way. They will pay attention to you, but we want to frame ourselves well. We want good audio. We want good lighting. And the last thing I want to talk about is your backdrop. Now, behind me, I just have a simple photography backdrop. It's a 5x7 that I got for $18. I have about a dozen backdrops that I'll rotate. Do you need a backdrop? No, but make sure your backdrop is simple. The busier your background, the more distracted your learner will be. They're going to be wanting to know what books you have on your bookshelves, when you do laundry, if your laundry is hanging over an exercise bike, right? So just make sure that your background's simple, or invest in a backdrop. Now that we have ourselves framed, we have audio, we have lighting, and we look professional, the camera is eye view, how do we now engage? So one of the things we want to do when we start out of the gate is set the hook. There's a radio station that your students will turn into called WIIFM, and that stands for What's in It for Me. So one of the important things we have to do online is when we have the learners come into the room, and this is whether it's an hour presentation, a week presentation, is we have to give them the benefit of what are they going to learn? How are they going to do their job better? What are they personally going to gain by listening to you as the instructor through this camera? So you want to hit them with that benefit right off the bat. For example, when I teach mentoring, I might start off my session with this line: you get paid according to the value you provide your organization. So if you want to get paid more, you have to learn to add more value. One of the ways to add more value is through mentoring. So now I'm giving them something to think about of why they're attending this session. And then I will go into who am I. Don't start with who are you, because nobody cares who you are until they know what they're going to learn. So always start with the hook of what's in it for them, then go into your introduction. The other thing that will interest your learners is when you give your introduction, tailor it to the material you're teaching. Don't give the same introduction every time, because they're going to want to know why are you tied to this material. Another thing is you want to keep eye contact with the camera. Every time we break eye contact, we give our students permission to not pay attention. We give them permission to look away from learning or listening to you. So as much as we can, we want to keep that eye contact. Now, one of the things that can distract you from that is that chat box. Now, I love the chat box. Deb touched on it, and I'm going to touch on it in just a moment. I love the chat box. It's one of the ways I believe is an advantage to teaching online. So let me give you the issue and the advantage. The issue to the chat box is an instructor can always be looking and reading the chat box and lose their pace of what they're supposed to be teaching. And now they're so distracted by the chat box, they've totally lost eye contact through the camera with the students. And now you're going to lose that momentum. So it's a real trick as an instructor, be glancing at the chat box, camera, glancing at the chat box, camera. Now, here's the advantage to the chat box is that in some classes, we do not require the camera to be on, but to get credit for the course, you must be participating in the chat box. When I was teaching in the classroom, I had no way of who was taking notes, who was really with me all the way, were they daydreaming? That was hard in the classroom, but online, this is an advantage, because I could ask a question and see who's participating in that question. And now I know what percentage of the class or who's really following along. So this is one advantage that online has. But once again, it's okay to look at your notes. It's okay to look at the chat box, but you want to keep engaged, as much eye contact as you can. There's a phrase I like to use when working on the camera, and that is talk through the camera, not to the camera. When you just treat the camera as a lens, you don't feel the connection. And believe me, the students don't feel the connection with you. But talking through the camera is imagining that they're sitting right on the other side of your computer. You're just having a conversation with them. Now, here are some other techniques to keep your students engaged. Sometimes I will say, if you're still with me, give me a yes in the chat box. And I want to see who's given me a yes in the chat box. What percentage of my students? Deb mentioned this earlier. I might also say this. I have a favor to ask you. What I'm going to cover right now is really strategic. So if you're multitasking, I'm going to ask you to lean in a little bit and really focus on this next slide. You see, I'm prepping them. I'm slowing my pace down. I'm asking them to join me in a favor. I'm telling them how critical this is. So sometimes, instead of just being like that train running down the track, you just want to slow down and ask them a favor to really pay attention. Sometimes I'll do this. If you're still with me, give me a virtual nod out there. I can see you. Now, of course, that may sound silly, but I'm capturing their attention to join me, once again, looking for that virtual head nod. One of the hardest things I think about teaching online is this, and once again, it kind of goes to what Deb mentioned, is the power of the pause. Remember this, learning happens in the silence. I want to repeat that for you. Learning happens in the silence. When we train online, sometimes as an instructor, we can just talk, and never give those pauses for our students to engage and learn. If you're challenging your students, they need time to reflect on what you're saying, critically think, and figure out how they apply it to their life, and that takes time. If you don't give that pause, there's no way for them to figure out how that content fits in their life and how they're going to apply it. So let me give you an example of this. If I'm teaching on something I'm goal setting, I might say something like this. It surprises me People spend more time planning their grocery lists, planning their weekends, planning their vacations than they do planning their lives. Most people spend more time planning their grocery list than planning their lives.
Very insightful.
Now, if I paused on purpose, and that was a long pause, I'll sit back because, see, I just dropped something on them that I want them to reflect on. And if I just keep talking after that, I've lost that learning point. I've lost that chance for them to really reflect. So don't be afraid. You know, it is so unnatural for there to be silence when you're talking through a microphone and a camera. It's not natural. But just remember, they need that time to digest the information. The other thing, always assume there's questions. Now, what I have found is by teaching online, 80 to 85% of your questions are going to come through the chat box, not through audio, somebody turning on their mic. Very rare will people turn on their mic, but they'll be very busy in the chat box. So don't forget to allow time for them to ask questions. So here's what I say. I never ask, does anybody have any questions for me? I don't like that, saying that line as an instructor. Here's why. When you say, does anybody have any questions for me? If I'm a learner, the way I just phrased it, I'm thinking, well, I do have a question, but the way Mark just said it, I'm afraid to ask it. I don't want to be called out. Maybe he covered it. I shouldn't ask it. See, too much gray area for the students. So here's what I say. I'm going to stop now. What questions do you have for me? Do you see how nice that is? What questions do you have for me? I'm assuming there's questions. Now, if I ask a question, it goes back to what I just taught you. You must pause. So what questions do you have for me? And I'll let that pause linger. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, but I'm letting them say, well, do I have a question? Okay, it's okay. Let me try to think of a question, right? So what questions do you have for me? Always assume there's questions. The last point I want to cover is what keeps a student's interest is changing the media if you can. So, for example, I might train 2 to 3 slides and then ask them to participate in the chat box. I might train a slide and then have them turn on their annotate tool to participate in circling A, B, C, D, or E. I may train a couple slides and then bring in a video from YouTube. I may train a few slides and then have them go to the breakout rooms. Now, Deb mentioned breakout rooms. I love breakout rooms because it gives you, the instructor, a break, as well as it gets the students engaged with each other. Whenever they're engaged with each other and they're teaching each other, your learning curve goes up. Students learn more from each other than the instructor most of the time. So I love putting them in breakout groups for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then bringing them out of the great breakout room and asking what did they learn from each other, or what was covered, or whatever the assignment was. The other reason I love using different media, such as video and breakouts or polling, it also gives me the time as an instructor to glance at the chat box to catch up on the chat to see if I've missed any questions. So you want to build in time for you as the instructor with using all those different media devices, the chat, the YouTubes, the polling, the annotation tools. The more you keep that student engaged, the less they feel like they can just sit back and just be a passive learner in your course. You want them to be an active learner. Tiffany?
Thank you, Mark. That was some great